The USS Indianapolis wasn't just any ship. She was a gray ghost of the Pacific, a heavy cruiser designed for speed and carrying a secret that would change the world. Her final mission was one of the most critical of World War II, to deliver vital components for the atomic bomb, the very device that would bring the war to an end. This mission was so top secret that few knew its true nature, and even fewer understood the immense stakes involved. On board was a young Marine named Edgar Harrell, fresh-faced and full of the kind of hope only a young man can possess. He was just one of many, but his story would become a testament to human endurance, a chilling tale born from the deepest parts of the ocean. The ship cut through the Philippine Sea, a vast expanse of water that, on the night of July 29, 1945, was deceptively calm. The sky was dark, moonless, offering no light to betray their presence. This was a deliberate choice. To maintain secrecy, the Indianapolis was traveling unescorted, a decision based on the belief that the area was relatively clear of enemy submarines. There was a false sense of security, a quiet before the storm that would soon engulf them. The ocean stretched out, serene and endless, hiding a predator lurking beneath the waves. Suddenly, without warning, 2 torpedoes slammed into the ship's starboard side. The first hit near the bow, tearing a massive hole and igniting aviation fuel. A huge explosion ripped through the ship. Moments later, a second torpedo struck near the midship, hitting fuel tanks and magazines. The force of the blasts was incredible, throwing men from their bunks and plunging parts of the ship into immediate chaos. Fires erupted, spreading quickly, and the ship began to list violently. The lights flickered, then died, leaving the crew in a terrifying darkness, punctuated by the roar of explosions and the screams of injured men. Edgar Harrell was in his bunk when the first torpedo hit. The shock threw him out and he landed hard. He knew instantly that something terrible had happened. The ship was dying. The lights went out and the sound of tearing metal filled the air. There was no time to think, only to act. He fought his way through the smoke and darkness, past mangled bulkheads and panicked shipmates. The ship was going down fast. He remembered the training, the instructions to abandon ship, but nothing could prepare him for the sheer terror of that moment. He scrambled to the deck, the ship already at a severe angle, and launched himself into the inky black water just as the Indianapolis rolled over and plunged into the abyss. It took only 12 minutes for the massive cruiser to disappear beneath the waves, taking with it hundreds of men trapped inside. The water was thick with oil and debris, and the smell of burning fuel hung heavy in the air. Hundreds of men, those who had managed to escape, were now floating in the vast, dark ocean. The immediate shock of the cold water was quickly replaced by a chilling realization. They were alone, miles from anywhere, and the ocean was not a friendly place. Edgar found himself bobbing in the water, surrounded by the moans and cries of his shipmates. He managed to link up with a small group, clinging to floating wreckage. The initial terror of the sinking gave way to a new, gnawing fear. They were in the middle of nowhere, and the water around them was dark, deep, and full of unseen things. The oil stung their eyes and coated their skin, making it hard to breathe. This was just the beginning of their nightmare. The sun began its slow descent, dragging with it the last vestiges of hope for the men bobbing in the Philippine Sea. As the light faded, the vastness of the ocean grew, making their small group feel even more insignificant, more isolated. The initial chaos of the sinking had given way to a grim quiet, punctuated only by the lapping of waves and the occasional cough or whimper. Men called out, their voices hoarse, trying to locate friends, to form larger groups, to find some comfort in numbers. But the darkness swallowed their cries, making the ocean feel even more immense and uncaring. Injuries from the torpedo blasts and the frantic escape were already starting to fester. Burns from the explosions, cuts from jagged metal, and the general trauma of a sinking ship were made worse by the salt water and the thick black oil that coated everything. The oil stung their eyes, making it hard to see, and it clung to their skin, a constant greasy reminder of the disaster. As night deepened, a new enemy emerged, the insidious chill of hypothermia. The tropical waters were warm during the day, but at night the constant immersion began to drain their body heat. Shivering started, then uncontrollable shaking, as the cold seeped into their bones. Then came the first scream that wasn't from a man in pain from an injury. It was a cry of pure, unadulterated terror. A man had been pulled under. Then another. The horrifying realization spread like wildfire through the scattered groups. Sharks. They were here, drawn by the blood and the commotion, turning their watery prison into a feeding ground. The initial attacks were on the wounded, those too weak to fight, or the dead whose bodies floated listlessly. But soon the sharks grew bolder, their dark shapes circling, their fins cutting through the surface of the water with chilling regularity. The psychological impact was devastating. To see a shipmate, moments ago a living, breathing man, suddenly disappear beneath the waves, ripped apart by an unseen predator, shattered any remaining sense of security. Edgar Harrell, clinging to a piece of debris with his small group, felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He tried to keep his voice steady, to reassure the men around him. But fear was a palpable thing, a heavy blanket that threatened to smother them all. He urged them to stay close, to keep moving their legs to ward off the cold, and to splash at any sign of a fin. They desperately scanned the water for anything larger, any life raft, any piece of wreckage that could offer more stability. But there was nothing. Just the endless ocean, the growing darkness and the constant terrifying presence of the sharks. Thirst began to gnaw at them, a dry, rasping sensation that made their throats ache. Hunger was there too, a dull ache in their stomachs, but water was the immediate pressing concern. Surrounded by an ocean of it, yet utterly unable to drink. The irony was a cruel joke. The night dragged on, an eternity of fear and cold. Sounds of splashes and screams echoed across the water, each one a fresh stab of terror. They knew the sharks were still out there, always out there, beneath them, around them, a constant, unseen threat. With every passing hour, the hope of rescue dwindled. No planes, no ships, just them, adrift, in a shark-infested hell, with the bitter realization that they might have been forgotten. The night's horrors were just the beginning. The relentless tropical sun rose with a vengeance, beating down on the survivors with an almost physical force. After the chilling horrors of the night, the day brought a new, equally brutal enemy. Heat. The ocean, which had felt so cold hours before, now radiated a stifling warmth that intensified the effects of their growing dehydration. Their lips cracked and peeled, their tongues swelled, and their throats felt like sandpaper. Every breath was a struggle, every swallow a painful reminder of the water they desperately needed, but couldn't have. The psychological torment of being surrounded by billions of gallons of water they couldn't drink was almost as bad as the physical pain. Mirages danced on the horizon, teasing them with images of distant ships and islands that vanished as they squinted. The overwhelming urge to drink seawater became an agonizing battle, every fiber of Edgar Harrell's being screamed for a drink. He saw men around him, their eyes wild with thirst, scoop up handfuls of the salty liquid. He knew it was poison, that it would only accelerate their demise, but the compulsion was almost unbearable. He fought it for as long as he could, trying to remember everything he'd been taught about survival, but after what felt like an eternity, with his mouth a dry cavern and his body screaming for moisture, he gave in. He cupped his hands, brought the water to his lips, and drank. The immediate effect was horrifying. His stomach rebelled, churning violently, and within minutes he was vomiting, expelling what little fluid remained in his system. The salt made his mouth feel even drier, and a burning sensation spread through his gut. It was a mistake he would never forget, a desperate act born of utter despair. As dehydration and salt poisoning took hold, the line between reality and illusion began to blur for many. Hallucinations became common, vivid, and terrifying. Phantom ships appeared on the horizon, their sails billowing only to disappear when someone pointed them out. Men spoke to loved ones who weren't there, or argued with officers long dead. Harrell himself saw strange things, a bustling city beneath the waves, complete with cars and buildings, or a delicious meal spread out before him on the water. These visions were so real, so compelling, that it was hard to convince himself they weren't. The delirium made it difficult to communicate, to coordinate, and to maintain any semblance of order within the groups. Minds began to unravel under the immense pressure. The sharks, meanwhile, grew bolder. They had tasted blood, and the constant presence of so many helpless bodies made them fearless. Their attacks became more frequent, no longer just targeting the dead or severely wounded. They would circle, bump against the survivors, and then, with terrifying speed, drag another man down. The survivors tried to splash, to kick, to beat the water with their fists, but it was often futile. The constant threat, the knowledge that at any moment you could be the next one chosen, was a psychological torture that never let up. Every shadow in the water, every ripple sent a jolt of fear through them. With each passing hour, the hope of rescue faded a little more. No planes flew overhead. No ships appeared on the horizon. The vast, empty ocean stretched in every direction, a cruel mirror reflecting their despair. The growing belief that they had been forgotten, that no one knew where they were or what had happened, was a crushing weight. Numbers dwindled steadily across all the scattered groups. Some men simply slipped away, too weak to hold on. Others, driven mad by thirst and fear, swam off into the open ocean, convinced they saw land or a rescue vessel, never to be seen again. The ocean slowly claimed its victims, one by one, leaving the remaining survivors in a state of profound, bone-deep weariness, their bodies failing, their minds teetering on the edge. The deepening madness among the survivors was a terrible thing to witness. Men who had been brave and steady just days before now acted strangely. Some just stared into the water, muttering to themselves. Others started fighting over small pieces of debris or imagined slights. There was one man who tried to arrest another for stealing his non-existent sandwich. The struggle to keep a clear head was constant, a fight against their own failing bodies and minds. It was like watching a slow, painful unraveling. Edgar Harrell fought his own battle with these hallucinations. They weren't just vague images, they were incredibly real. He saw his mother standing on the water, calling his name, her arms outstretched. He heard familiar voices from home, talking about everyday things, so clearly he almost answered them. Sometimes the ocean itself would transform, showing him a bustling carnival, complete with music and laughing people. He knew deep down that these weren't real, but his mind kept trying to trick him. He would pinch himself, bite his lip, anything to break the spell. He had to keep asking himself, is this real? Or is my mind playing tricks? It was an exhausting internal fight, trying not to give in to the comfort of these false realities. Giving in felt like giving up. In those darkest moments, when everything else seemed to fail, Harrell found himself relying on his faith. He prayed, sometimes silently, sometimes out loud, repeating verses he remembered from church. He wasn't the only one. He saw other men, even some who hadn't seemed particularly religious before, whispering prayers. It was a way to find a little bit of peace, a small anchor in the chaos. The idea that there was something bigger than the ocean, something that cared, gave them a tiny flicker of hope. It wasn't a strong hope, not a belief that rescue was coming any minute, but a hope that they weren't completely alone, completely forgotten. This faint hope, this spiritual reflection, was what kept some of them from just letting go. The losses continued, a constant heartbreaking reminder of their grim situation. Harrell watched friends, men he had shared meals and stories with, simply fade away. One moment they were there, struggling, and the next they were gone. Sometimes it was the sharks, a sudden splash and a scream. More often it was the quiet surrender to exhaustion, dehydration, or the madness that finally broke their will. It was hard to watch, harder still to accept. There was nothing they could do. When a shipmate finally passed, they would gently push the body away, a silent, grim farewell to someone who had fought so hard. Each loss chipped away at the remaining survivors, leaving a heavier emotional toll. The grief was real, even in their desperate state. The search for fresh water was a constant, agonizing obsession. Every cloud in the sky brought a surge of desperate hope, only to be crushed when the sun continued to beat down relentlessly. They tried to collect dew from their skin, but there was none. They looked for anything floating that might hold water, but there was nothing. Once a brief light shower passed over them. The men tried to catch the drops on their tongues, but it was barely enough to wet their lips. The frustration was immense, a deep, burning disappointment every time the search proved futile. The vast ocean surrounded them, an endless, mocking promise of water they couldn't drink. It was a cruel irony, trapped in an ocean of water, dying of thirst. The lack of fresh water was the most immediate, brutal reality of their survival, a constant torment that overshadowed everything else. The most agonizing truth for the men adrift was not just their immediate suffering, but the chilling silence from the outside world. No rescue planes, no ships, nothing. The USS Indianapolis had vanished without a trace, and for days, no one even knew it was gone. This wasn't an accident. It was a catastrophic breakdown of naval protocol and communication. The ship had been on a top-secret mission, so hush-hush that its movements were not being tracked in the usual way. When it failed to arrive at Leyte Gulf on schedule, there was no immediate alarm. It was assumed it had simply been delayed, perhaps by weather or some other routine issue. Messages about its expected arrival went unread or were misfiled. There was no distress signal sent because the ship went down so fast, in less than 15 minutes, that there was no time to send one. Even if they had, the radios were likely destroyed in the initial torpedo strikes. This combination of extreme secrecy and broken communication lines meant that hundreds of men were left to die slowly, completely forgotten by the very system they served. The Navy, focused on the final stages of the war, simply didn't realize one of its most important ships and its crew was missing. The critical lapse in time before anyone even noticed the Indianapolis was overdue was a massive failure. 2 days passed before the ship was finally reported missing. Even then, the initial response was slow, bogged down by bureaucracy and a general disbelief that such a significant vessel could simply disappear. There were reports of delayed messages, officers on leave, and a general lack of urgency. The Naval Command, caught up in the immense logistics of the war, struggled to piece together what had happened. It was a chaotic situation, and the men in the water paid the price for every hour of delay. The longer it took, the more men succumbed to the elements, the sharks, and their own despair. Each passing sunrise without a sign of rescue chipped away at their will to live, reinforcing the terrible fear that they had indeed been completely forgotten. Then, on the 4th day, a speck appeared in the sky. Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn, piloting a PV-1 Ventura bomber on a routine patrol, spotted an oil slick. He flew lower, curious, and then saw them. Tiny figures scattered across the vast blue, hundreds of men adrift. It was an unbelievable sight, a scene of horror and desperation. Gwynn immediately radioed for help, his voice filled with urgency and disbelief. He dropped a life raft and a radio transmitter, marking the location. His call sparked a frantic scramble, finally alerting the Navy to the true scope of the disaster. For the first time in nearly 4 days, there was a glimmer of hope. The news hit the naval base like a shockwave. A massive search and rescue operation was launched. Ships and planes from all directions were diverted to the coordinates Gwynn had provided. But the ocean is vast, and the survivors were spread out, many of them barely conscious, clinging to life. The challenge was immense: how to find and pull hundreds of scattered, injured men from the water, often in the dark, with sharks still circling. Every minute counted, and the clock was ticking for the men who had already endured so much. From Harrell's perspective, the first sign of potential rescue was a sound, a distant hum that slowly grew louder. He looked up, squinting against the sun, and saw a plane. It was a tiny dot at first, then it grew. Circling overhead, a wave of raw primal hope surged through him, mixed with a deep, almost paralyzing fear that it wasn't real, just another hallucination. He watched as something dropped from the plane, splashing into the water. It was a raft. The sight was almost too much to bear. He yelled, his voice hoarse and weak, trying to get the attention of the others in his group. "Look! A plane! They see us!" The men around him, many too weak to respond, simply stared, their eyes wide with a fragile, desperate hope. But the plane eventually flew off, and the wait for actual rescue, for a ship to pull them from the water, felt like an eternity. The hope was there, but so was the crushing uncertainty. The wait, agonizing as it was, finally ended. More planes arrived, not just to search, but to help. They dropped more rafts, some with fresh water and medical supplies. The sight of these supplies bobbing in the water sparked a desperate energy in the survivors. Men who had been barely moving found a new burst of strength, paddling with weak arms towards the orange rafts. It was chaotic, with men struggling to climb aboard, some falling back into the water, but it was a chaos born of hope. Harrell and his group managed to reach one of the rafts, pulling themselves onto its flimsy surface. The taste of the fresh water, though rationed, was like nothing he had ever experienced, a life-giving force that slowly began to push back against the delirium. Soon after the planes, the ships came. First, a destroyer, the USS Cecil J. Doyle, appeared on the horizon, a dark silhouette against the setting sun. The sight of it was overwhelming. Men wept openly, some screamed with relief, others simply stared, too far gone to fully grasp what was happening. The Doyle's crew, alerted by the pilot Gwyn, had raced to the scene. What they found was a nightmare. Hundreds of men, many burned, injured, and half-eaten by sharks, floating in a vast oil-slicked expanse. It was a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Harrell remembered the moment he was pulled from the water. Strong hands reached down, grabbing him. He was so weak, his body felt like a dead weight. The simple act of being lifted was painful, his skin raw from the sun and salt. He was laid on the deck of the destroyer, the hard, solid surface feeling alien after days of endless water. The smell of diesel and antiseptic filled his nostrils. Medics were everywhere, moving quickly, assessing the most critical cases. Someone pressed a cup of water to his lips, and he drank it slowly, savoring every drop. They cleaned his wounds, wrapped him in a blanket, and gave him a shot that dulled the sharp edges of his pain. He looked around at the other rescued men, their faces gaunt, eyes hollow, some still muttering to themselves, lost in their hallucinations. The scale of the tragedy became brutally clear. Even in the relative safety of the ship, the psychological scars were already deep. Many men were in shock, unable to speak, their minds still trapped in the ocean's horrors. The constant fear of sharks, the screams of their friends, the gnawing hunger and thirst, these memories were etched onto their souls. Harrell felt a strange mix of relief and a heavy emptiness. He was alive, but so many were not. The guilt of survival, a burden many would carry, began to settle in. He saw men staring blankly at the ocean, unable to tear their eyes away, as if expecting another attack. The trauma was fresh, raw, and would take years, if not a lifetime, to process. The journey to safety was slow, careful. The Doyle and other arriving rescue ships were packed with survivors, each receiving what medical attention could be given at sea. The destination was a naval hospital, a place where they could begin the long road to recovery. For Harrell, it meant rehydration, proper food, and treating the severe burns and saltwater sores that covered his body. Each small step of physical healing was a reminder of what he had endured. But he knew that the journey toward mental healing would be far longer, much more complicated. The images of the ocean, the sharks, and the faces of his lost shipmates would not fade easily. He was safe, but the horror of those days and nights in the water would forever be a part of him. The news of the USS Indianapolis disaster hit the American public like a tidal wave, even though it was initially kept quiet. Once the story broke, the nation was shocked. People wanted answers. They wanted to know how a ship carrying such a vital cargo could simply disappear, leaving hundreds of men to die in the ocean. The initial focus was on the incredible bravery of the rescue teams, the pilots who spotted them, and the sailors who pulled them from the water. But quickly, that shifted to accountability. Someone had to be blamed. That blame fell squarely on Captain Charles B. McVeigh III, the commanding officer of the USS Indianapolis. The Navy, under immense public pressure and facing questions about its own protocols, made the controversial decision to court-martial him. The charges were serious: negligence and hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag, which they claimed made him an easier target for the Japanese submarine. The legal proceedings were a spectacle, a desperate attempt to find a scapegoat for an unimaginable tragedy. McVeigh became the first and only Navy captain in history to be court-martialed for losing his ship in wartime. Edgar Harrell, like many survivors, had strong feelings about Captain McVeigh, while some survivors, driven by their own trauma and grief, felt McVeigh was at fault. Many more, including Harrell, saw him as a victim himself. Harrell respected McVeigh's leadership during the sinking, noting how the captain remained calm and gave clear orders. He believed McVeigh was a good officer who had done his best in an impossible situation. The idea that McVeigh was solely responsible for the ship's fate, especially given the secrecy of the mission and the lack of escort, felt deeply unjust to Harrell and many others. They knew the real story was far more complex than the Navy was letting on. The public outcry and the Navy's need for a quick resolution created a perfect storm that swallowed the captain whole. The long-term impact on the survivors was profound. Even after physical wounds healed, the mental scars remained. Post-traumatic stress was a constant companion for many. They lived with survivors' guilt, haunted by the faces of those they couldn't save. Nightmares were common, replaying the horrors of the ocean, the sharks, the screams. Reintegrating into civilian life was a huge challenge. Many struggled to talk about what they had experienced, finding it impossible to convey the sheer terror and isolation. They carried the weight of those days and nights, often in silence, for the rest of their lives. Some found solace in each other, but the trauma never truly left them. Decades passed, but the fight for Captain McVeigh's exoneration never stopped. Survivors like Edgar Harrell believed deeply that McVeigh had been wronged. They spoke out, wrote letters, and lobbied officials, determined to clear their captain's name. They understood that the blame laid at McVeigh's feet was a convenient way for the Navy to avoid admitting its own systemic failures. Finally, after years of relentless effort, a bittersweet victory came. In 2000, Captain McVeigh was posthumously exonerated by Congress, acknowledging that the Navy had failed to provide him with critical intelligence about submarine threats. It was a partial victory, as his court-martial conviction was never fully overturned, but it brought some measure of peace to his family and to the survivors who had fought so hard for him. The lasting legacy of injustice, however, remained a stark reminder of the human cost of bureaucratic failures and the desperate need for a scapegoat. Even with the exoneration, the bond among the USS Indianapolis survivors remained incredibly strong, a unique brotherhood forged in the crucible of shared suffering. They understood each other in a way no one else could. Annual reunions became a sacred tradition, a time to reconnect, remember, and heal. These gatherings weren't just social events, they were vital for their mental health, a space where they could openly discuss the unspeakable horrors they had endured, knowing they would be met with understanding, not judgment. These men, now old, carried the weight of history, and their shared experience made them keepers of a story that needed to be told. They made sure the world didn't forget the 880 men who died. Edgar Harrell, in particular, dedicated a large part of his later life to sharing his story. He wasn't just recounting a historical event, he was giving testimony, a powerful message about faith, resilience, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. He spoke at schools, churches, and veterans' events, his voice steady, his eyes still holding the distant memory of the ocean. His efforts were not just about remembering the past, but about educating future generations on the realities of war and the importance of never giving up. He honored the memory of those who perished by ensuring their sacrifice had meaning, transforming his unimaginable suffering into a beacon of hope and a testament to survival. The Indianapolis disaster left behind a trail of crucial lessons, not just for the Navy but for humanity. Militarily, it forced a re-evaluation of communication protocols, the necessity of escorts even in supposedly safe waters, and the critical importance of robust search and rescue operations. The failures in reporting the ship overdue and the subsequent delay in initiating a search were stark reminders of how bureaucracy could cost lives. On a human level, the story taught profound lessons about resilience in the face of despair, the power of hope, and the incredible will to survive against impossible odds. It underscored the importance of remembering historical tragedies, not to dwell on sorrow, but to learn from mistakes and honor those who sacrificed everything. Memorials to the USS Indianapolis and its crew stand as solemn reminders. From plaques in naval academies to monuments in their hometowns, these tributes ensure that the story of the ship and its men is never forgotten. The discovery of the wreck in 2017, lying almost 18 U-errant feet beneath the Pacific, was a monumental moment. It brought a sense of closure to many, confirming the final resting place of their shipmates and providing a tangible link to the past. It reignited public interest, ensuring that new generations would learn about the courage and sacrifice of the men of the Indianapolis. Edgar Harrell's final message, woven into every speech and every interview, was always one of hope, faith, and forgiveness. He bore no bitterness, choosing instead to focus on the lessons learned and the strength found in adversity. His legacy is that of a survivor who, despite experiencing unimaginable suffering, emerged with his spirit intact, turning his ordeal into a powerful testimony to the human spirit's capacity to overcome even the most profound adversity. He showed that even in the darkest depths of despair, faith and the will to live can prevail, leaving an indelible mark on all who heard his story. A true beacon of enduring human resilience. The USS Indianapolis cut through the Pacific waves, a phantom in the vast ocean. It wasn't just another warship. It was a vessel carrying a secret that would change the world. Deep within its steel belly, nestled securely, were the components of the atomic bomb, the very heart of Little Boy. This was a mission cloaked in absolute secrecy, its importance immeasurable. Every mile covered, every wave parted, brought them closer to delivering a weapon that promised to end a brutal war. Aboard this ship was Edgar Harrell, a young Marine, barely out of his teens. He joined the service with a sense of duty, a quiet determination, and the aspirations of any young man ready to serve his country. He couldn't have known the unimaginable ordeal that lay ahead, an ordeal that would test the very limits of human endurance. The ship sailed alone, a solitary speck in the immense Philippine Sea. Secrecy was paramount, and in the prevailing military thinking of the time, the threat in that particular stretch of ocean was considered low. So, there was no escort, no protective screen of destroyers or frigates, just the Indianapolis, its crew and its world-altering cargo, pushing through the calm, moonless night. The air was still, the water dark and inscrutable. A deceptive tranquility hung over the sea, a perfect camouflage for the horror that was about to unfold. The men on deck might have felt a sense of peace, unaware of the lurking danger beneath the surface. Each passing minute brought them closer to an unexpected and brutal encounter. Suddenly, without warning, two thunderous explosions ripped through the ship's hull. The Japanese submarine I-58, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, had found its target. The torpedoes struck with devastating force, one hitting the bow, the other midship. Fire erupted instantly, tearing through the vessel. Men were thrown from their bunks, from their posts, as the ship shuddered violently. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of twisting metal, roaring flames, and the screams of the injured. The Indianapolis, once a proud warship, became a rapidly sinking coffin. The lights flickered, then died, plunging the ship into a terrifying darkness, broken only by the orange glow of the fires. Chaos reigned. The ship was going down fast, listing heavily to starboard. Orders were shouted, but in the pandemonium, many were lost or ignored. Edgar Harrell, disoriented but driven by an instinct to survive, struggled to make his way through the damaged corridors. Smoke filled his lungs, and debris blocked his path. He pushed past injured shipmates, the urgency of the moment overriding everything else. He knew he had to get out, had to get to the deck. The ship's angle grew steeper by the second. Finally, he reached the railing, saw the churning water below, and jumped. The Indianapolis, fatally wounded, continued its rapid descent, disappearing beneath the waves in mere minutes, taking with it hundreds of men and its vital secret. Then came the cold shock of the water, thick with oil and debris. Hundreds of men were now struggling in the dark, open ocean. The initial shock of the sinking gave way to a new, terrifying realization. They were alone, adrift in shark-infested waters. The oil coated everything, making it difficult to breathe, stinging their eyes. Harrell found himself amidst a small cluster of survivors, clinging to what little wreckage they could find. The screams of the dying and injured echoed across the water, a chilling testament to the scale of the disaster. The vastness of the ocean, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like an inescapable prison. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a pale, indifferent light on their desperate situation. Their ordeal had only just begun. The sun, which had offered a brief, cold comfort, soon dipped below the horizon, pulling with it any last shred of hope. Darkness swallowed the ocean, a thick, oppressive blanket that amplified every sound and hid every terror. The men, still reeling from the shock of the sinking, now faced an even more daunting enemy, the night itself. The vastness of the ocean, stretching endlessly in every direction, pressed in on them, making their isolation feel absolute. Small groups tried to huddle together, their voices hoarse from shouting, trying to find familiar faces in the gloom. Harrell, in his small cluster, called out names, but the replies were few and far between. The silence between the cries for help was almost as terrifying as the cries themselves. Hours blurred into an agonizing eternity. The initial adrenaline rush faded, replaced by the gnawing pains of injuries and the insidious creep of exposure. Many had suffered burns from the explosions, their skin raw and blistered. Others had deep cuts from flying debris. The salt water, initially a minor discomfort, now stung every open wound, making them throb with relentless pain. The thick oil from the ship coated their bodies, making their skin itch and burn, and stung their eyes, blurring their vision. As the tropical night wore on, a new, more dangerous threat began to settle in: hypothermia. Even in warm waters, prolonged immersion could chill a body to its core, slowly draining away strength and consciousness. Shivering became uncontrollable. Teeth chattered, and the will to fight began to waver for many. Then, the horror truly began. It started subtly, a sudden splash, a muffled scream cut short. The sharks, drawn by the scent of blood and the thrashing of hundreds of men, had arrived. At first they targeted the dead, those who had already succumbed to their injuries or the shock of the sinking. But soon their hunger grew bolder, their attacks more indiscriminate. A man would suddenly disappear, dragged beneath the surface with a terrifying swiftness. Another would scream, then fall silent, leaving only a widening pool of blood. The psychological impact was devastating. To see a comrade, moments ago struggling beside you, suddenly snatched away, was a terror beyond words. The men tried to kick, to splash, to make noise, anything to ward off the unseen predators lurking beneath them. But the sharks were relentless. Harrell, despite his own growing exhaustion and fear, tried to keep his small group together. He spoke in a low, steady voice, offering words of encouragement, trying to maintain some semblance of order. He knew morale was crucial. Once that went, everything went. They scanned the dark water desperately for any floating debris, a piece of wood, a life vest, anything that could offer more support than their own tired limbs. They managed to find a few pieces of wreckage, enough to form a small precarious raft of bodies and flotsam. The growing thirst was a constant burning sensation in their throats, but the immediate concern was survival through the night and the sharks. Every splash, every ripple in the water sent a jolt of terror through them. The night dragged on, a horrifying symphony of screams, gurgles, and the chilling silence that followed each attack. The constant threat of sharks, the cold, the pain, and the overwhelming feeling of being utterly alone in the vast, indifferent ocean chipped away at their sanity. Many began to talk to themselves, to hallucinate, to give up. The sounds of splashes and desperate cries echoed in the darkness, a stark reminder of their dwindling numbers. Harrell held on, his mind fixated on the improbable hope of rescue, a hope that seemed to shrink with every passing minute. He watched the stars, a million distant eyes, and wondered if anyone out there knew they were gone. The realization that they might have been forgotten, that no one was coming, was a despair almost as deep as the ocean itself. This first night, in its sheer brutality, set the tone for the horrors that were yet to come. The brutal heat of the tropical sun rose with the dawn, turning the vast ocean into a shimmering, inescapable trap. The effects of dehydration, which had begun subtly the night before, now accelerated with merciless speed. Lips cracked and bled, tongues swelled, making speech difficult, and an intense burning thirst consumed every thought. Surrounded by an endless expanse of water, they were dying for lack of it, an agonizing irony that twisted their minds. The psychological torment was immense, watching the waves roll by, knowing that drinking it would only hasten their end. The overwhelming urge to drink seawater became a constant battle. Harrell, his throat feeling like sandpaper, fought against it with every fiber of his being. He knew the stories, the warnings. Salt water would drive you mad, then kill you. But after 2 days and 2 nights with no sign of rain or rescue, the thirst became unbearable. It was a primal, insistent demand that overshadowed everything else. He saw others around him give in, their eyes wild with desperation. He watched as they cupped their hands, drank deeply, and then, hours later, began to spasm, their bodies rejecting the poison. Still, the temptation gnawed at him. Finally, a moment of weakness, a breaking point. He dipped his head just for a second and swallowed a small mouthful. The immediate effect was a searing burn in his throat, followed by a wave of nausea. His stomach rebelled and he was violently sick. The horrifying physical effects confirmed what he already knew, but the brief, misguided attempt left him feeling even worse. His body now fighting not just dehydration, but the salt he had willingly introduced. The mental breakdown caused by the combined forces of dehydration, saltwater poisoning, and relentless stress began to manifest in terrifying ways. Hallucinations became common, blurring the line between reality and illusion for many of the survivors. Harrell saw phantom ships on the horizon, their masts and sails clear against the sky, only for them to vanish as quickly as they appeared. He heard voices calling his name, conversations from long ago, and saw faces of loved ones smiling at him from the waves. Men around him spoke to dead comrades, argued with invisible figures, or simply stared blankly at the sky, their minds lost to the delirium. One man, convinced he was at a picnic, tried to share imaginary food with the others. Another believed he was on a train, asking when they would reach the next station. The world warped, becoming a cruel, twisted reflection of their deepest desires and fears. Meanwhile, the sharks, emboldened by the growing weakness of their prey, became even more aggressive. They no longer waited for the injured or the dead. They circled the groups, their dark fins cutting through the water with chilling purpose. Attacks became more frequent and brazen, often happening in broad daylight. Survivors tried to ward them off with kicks and desperate shouts, but their strength was fading. The constant psychological pressure of the unseen threat below, the knowledge that at any moment one of them could be dragged down, was almost as terrifying as the attacks themselves. Every splash, every shadow, every shift in the water sent shivers of dread through their exhausted bodies. The absence of search planes or ships became a crushing weight on their spirits. Each sunrise brought a fresh wave of hope, quickly dashed by the empty sky. The days blended into an agonizing eternity, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun and the dwindling numbers of their comrades. The growing belief that they had been forgotten, that no one knew where they were or what had happened, settled into the groups like a cold, heavy blanket. The initial surge of adrenaline and the raw will to survive was slowly being replaced by a profound sense of abandonment. Their hope, once a flickering flame, was now a tiny ember, threatening to extinguish completely with each passing, empty hour. They were alone, adrift in an indifferent ocean, with no one coming to save them. The deepening madness among the survivors led to more than just hallucinations. It brought about a psychological breakdown that manifested in erratic and sometimes violent behavior. Men who had once been friends turned on each other over scraps of imagined food or perceived slights. Arguments erupted, fueled by thirst and despair, often escalating into physical altercations that left the already weakened men even more injured. Some would simply drift away from the group, mumbling incoherently, convinced they were heading for shore or a waiting ship, only to vanish forever into the vastness of the ocean. Others sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide and unseeing, completely detached from their horrific reality, staying sane. Maintaining any semblance of normal thought became an hourly battle. Harrell fought his own personal war against the vivid hallucinations. He saw his wife, Phyllis, standing on the water, beckoning him to come closer. Her smile was real, her voice clear, but he knew it wasn't true. He pictured his mother preparing Sunday dinner, the smell of roast chicken filling his nostrils, even as the metallic taste of salt water filled his mouth. These visions were not comforting. They were tormenting, offering a false hope that threatened to shatter his already fragile grip on reality. He would close his eyes, trying to force them away, then open them again, only to find another phantom shimmering on the horizon. A lifeboat filled with smiling sailors, a rescue plane flying low overhead. He had to constantly remind himself, sometimes out loud, that these were not real. He would dig his fingernails into his palm, the sharp pain a small anchor to the real world, a desperate attempt to distinguish between what was happening and what his mind was inventing. In the midst of this overwhelming despair and mental fog, Harrell found an unexpected, yet powerful anchor: his faith. He had grown up in the church, but like many young men, he hadn't truly tested the depths of his belief until now. Lying in the water, surrounded by death and madness, he began to pray. Not just quiet thoughts, but fervent pleas, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted into the indifferent sky. He prayed for strength, for deliverance, for guidance. He prayed for his shipmates, for their families, and for his own. This act of spiritual reflection, this constant communication with a higher power, became a lifeline. Other survivors, seeing his steadfastness, sometimes joined him, their voices hoarse but united in shared supplication. For some, this shared hope, however faint, was the only thing that kept them from giving up entirely. It was a silent internal promise that they were not utterly alone. The loss of comrades was a constant, heartbreaking reality. Each day, more men succumbed. Some, weakened by dehydration and injuries, simply slipped beneath the waves, their last breath a silent gurgle. Others, taken by the sharks in sudden, brutal attacks, left behind only a widening stain of blood. Harrell watched friends, men he had shared jokes and dreams with just days before, die in front of him. There was the young sailor who had talked excitedly about going home to see his newborn child, now gone. The grizzled veteran who had told stories of the Great War, now floating lifelessly. Each death was a fresh wound, a reminder of their dwindling numbers and the slim odds of survival. There was no proper burial, no final farewell. The grim task was simply to let go, to push the deceased away from the group, a silent, painful acknowledgement that their fight was over. The emotional toll of these losses was immense, adding layers of grief to their already unbearable suffering. Throughout this ordeal, the desperate search for fresh water remained a consuming obsession. Every cloud that passed overhead brought a surge of desperate hope, but the tropical skies remained largely clear. When a brief, meager shower did fall, men would try to catch the precious drops in their mouths, their hands, anything they could find. But these showers were few and far between, offering only a fleeting, tantalizing taste of relief before the sun returned, baking the ocean surface and intensifying their thirst. The immense frustration and disappointment when no sustainable source of fresh water was found weighed heavily on their spirits. They were surrounded by water, an infinite expanse, yet dying from its absence. It was a cruel irony, a constant mocking reminder of their predicament. The most haunting aspect of their ordeal, perhaps even more than the sharks, was the complete absence of any sign of rescue. The men of the Indianapolis had vanished, and for days no one in the outside world seemed to know. The ship's mission had been top secret, transporting critical components for the atomic bomb. This secrecy, which was meant to protect them, ultimately doomed them in the immediate aftermath of the sinking. Naval protocols designed for such emergencies utterly failed. No distress signal was sent from the ship. The explosions had destroyed their ability to transmit. Even if a signal had gone out, the secretive nature of their voyage meant their exact location wasn't widely known, and their lack of escort contributed to a dangerous complacency. The Navy assumed the ship had arrived at its destination because no one had reported it missing. This critical failure in communication channels and standard naval procedures created a void where the Indianapolis should have been. The delay in discovering their plight was agonizing. Days turned into an eternity on the open sea. The ship was due in Leyte on July 31st. When it didn't arrive, there was no immediate alarm. Bureaucratic failures and miscommunications meant that it took days for anyone in authority to realize something was terribly wrong. Instead of raising the alarm, the Navy initially assumed the ship had simply made an unscheduled stop or was delayed. It was a failure of monumental proportions, a cascade of overlooked details and broken protocols that left nearly 1,000 men adrift and slowly dying. The growing unease within the Navy as time passed was a cold comfort to the men who were already facing their own personal hell. Every passing hour meant more lives lost, more hope extinguished. Then, on the fourth day, August 2nd, a miracle happened. a PV-1 Ventura patrol plane, piloted by Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn, was on a routine anti-submarine patrol. Gwynn saw an oil slick, and curiosity led him to investigate. What he found was beyond belief. Hundreds of men, scattered across miles of ocean, waving desperately from the water. It was a sight that would forever be etched in his memory. The pilot's disbelief was immediate, quickly followed by a frantic call for assistance. He radioed back. Sighted many men in the water. The initial difficulty in comprehending the sheer scale of the disaster, the hundreds of bodies and faces looking up at him, was immense. He knew instantly that this was no ordinary rescue. The moment Gwynn's message went out, a frantic race against time began. Naval forces scrambled to the coordinates he provided. Planes were diverted. Destroyers were ordered to change course. The challenge was immense, locating and rescuing hundreds of scattered, barely visible survivors in the vast, unforgiving ocean. The urgency was palpable. Every minute counted. Command knew that after 4 days, many would be beyond help. But they had to try to save those still clinging to life. It was a desperate, all-hands-on-deck effort to correct the catastrophic oversight. From Harrell's perspective, the first signs of potential rescue were almost too surreal to be real. He was hallucinating frequently by this point, so when he first heard the distant rumble of an airplane engine, he dismissed it as another trick of his mind. Then the sound grew louder, more distinct. He looked up, shielding his eyes from the sun, and saw it, a plane flying low. It was a moment of dizzying hope mixed with profound disbelief. Could it be real? After days of nothing but ocean and sky, after giving up hope so many times, was this truly happening? The plane circled, then another appeared. They dropped rafts and flares. The men in his group, those still conscious and strong enough, let out hoarse cries of joy and relief. But even then, the waiting was far from over. The rafts were small, and the ocean was vast. The planes couldn't pick them up. They were only marking their position, signaling that help was on its way. The long wait for actual rescue to arrive stretched out, a final, agonizing test of their endurance. The planes circled overhead, a beacon of hope after endless days of despair. Soon, more aircraft joined them, dropping inflatable rafts, dye markers to make the survivors more visible, and even some emergency supplies. The sight was chaotic but filled with a new, frantic energy. Men who had been drifting aimlessly for days suddenly found a burst of strength, paddling with renewed purpose towards the bright orange rafts. Harrell and his group, though weak, focused all their remaining energy on reaching one. It was a struggle, pushing through the oil and debris, but the thought of solid ground, even if it was just an inflatable raft, spurred them on. The risks were still high. Some men, in their desperation, fought over the limited space, and others were too far gone to even notice the rescue efforts. But for those who could still move, it was the first real chance they had. Then, as dusk began to fall, the first surface vessel appeared on the horizon, the destroyer, USS Cecil J. Doyle. Its silhouette grew larger, a massive shape against the setting sun. The sight brought forth a wave of raw emotion from the survivors. Hoarse shouts, tears, and even some disbelieving laughter erupted across the water. The Doyle was quickly followed by other destroyers and smaller ships, converging on the scene. The scale of the tragedy became starkly clear as the ships moved through the water, navigating around hundreds of bodies, both living and dead. The crews on the rescue ships were met with a horrifying spectacle. Emaciated men, sunburned and covered in oil, many hallucinating, their eyes wide with fear and relief. The grim realization of the immense loss of life was immediate for the rescuers, who had prepared for a rescue, but not for this level of human suffering. Harrell remembered the moment he was pulled from the water. Strong hands reached down, lifting his weakened body onto the deck of a rescue ship. The immediate relief was overwhelming, a wave of sensation as his body finally left the cold, shark-infested water. He was shivering, his skin raw and peeling, his lips cracked and swollen. His mind, still reeling from days of dehydration and saltwater poisoning, struggled to process the sudden change. He felt a dizzying mix of relief and a strange numbness. Medics were everywhere, moving quickly, efficiently. They wrapped him in blankets, offered him sips of fresh water, small, carefully measured amounts to prevent further shock, and began to clean the oil from his skin. His injuries, mostly severe sunburn and saltwater sores, were immediately tended to. It was a stark contrast to the endless agonizing days adrift, a sudden return to a world of care and human touch. But even as his physical body began to receive attention, the psychological scars were already deeply etched. The immediate impact on the rescued men was profound. Many were quiet, withdrawn, their eyes still holding the vacant stare of men who had seen too much. Others wept openly, unable to hold back the flood of emotions. The difficulty in processing the trauma they had endured was evident in their stunned faces and disjointed stories. The lingering fear and shock were palpable, a heavy cloud that hung over the rescue ships. They were safe, but the horrors of the past 4 days would not simply disappear. The screams, the splashes, the faces of their friends being pulled under, these images would haunt them for a long time. The voyage to the naval hospital on Peleliu was a blur for Harrell. He drifted in and out of sleep, his body slowly rehydrating, his mind trying to reconcile what he had experienced with this new reality. On arrival, the medical staff worked tirelessly. The initial steps in physical recovery were slow and methodical. Careful rehydration, treatment of their severe sunburns and saltwater ulcers, and small, frequent meals to reintroduce nutrition to their starved bodies. For many, including Harrell, the road to recovery would be long. It wasn't just about healing the body. It was about beginning the slow, arduous journey toward mental healing, understanding that they had survived an ordeal that would forever define a part of their lives. The silence in the hospital wards was often broken by nightmares, by men reliving the terror of the open ocean, the sharks, and the desperate cries of their shipmates. The news of the USS Indianapolis disaster broke to the public with a shocking force. It wasn't just another casualty of war. It was a story of unimaginable suffering and a staggering loss of life. While the initial reports focused on the heroic rescue efforts and the sheer number of men saved against all odds, a deeper, more unsettling question quickly emerged. How could this have happened? The public wanted answers, and more importantly, they wanted accountability. This desire for someone to blame set the stage for one of the most controversial events in U.S. naval history. At the heart of this controversy was Captain Charles B. McVay III, the commanding officer of the USS Indianapolis. The Navy, under intense public and political pressure, made the unprecedented decision to court-martial a captain whose ship had been sunk in combat. The charges against McVay were severe: negligence for failing to zigzag and hazarding his ship by not issuing a timely order to abandon ship. The legal proceedings that followed were tense and highly publicized. Survivors, including some who had been with McVay, were called to testify. The weight of the entire tragedy seemed to rest on the shoulders of one man, a man who had also survived the same horrific ordeal as his crew. Edgar Harrell, like many survivors, had complex feelings about Captain McVay. He remembered McVay as a good officer, a man who had shared the same dangers and deprivation in the water. Harrell felt a deep sense of injustice regarding the court-martial. He believed McVay was a scapegoat, a convenient target for a Navy eager to deflect blame from its own systemic failures. While some survivors harbored resentment, believing McVay should have done more, a significant number, including Harrell, saw him as a victim of circumstances and a broken system. The divided opinions among the survivors regarding McVay's culpability reflected the immense pressure and confusion surrounding the disaster. The long-term impact on the survivors was profound and lasting. The physical wounds eventually healed, but the psychological toll endured for decades. Many suffered from severe post-traumatic stress, long before the condition was widely recognized or understood. Survivors' guilt became a heavy burden for some, a constant whisper asking why they lived when so many others perished. Nightmares were a common affliction, reliving the sharks, the screams, the thirst, and the endless expanse of the ocean. Reintegrating into civilian life after such an experience proved to be a monumental challenge. Many struggled with relationships, employment, and a sense of normalcy, forever marked by their time in shark hell. Years turned into decades, but the fight for Captain McVay's exoneration never truly faded. Survivors like Edgar Harrell, along with McVay's family, dedicated themselves to clearing his name. They wrote letters, gave interviews, and lobbied politicians, arguing that McVeigh was unfairly singled out. They pointed to evidence that the Navy had failed to inform McVeigh of the submarine threat in the area and that zigzagging was often left to a captain's discretion, especially when it could slow down a critical mission. This decades-long effort eventually paid off, though it was a bittersweet victory. In 2000, 32 years after McVeigh's death by suicide, the U.S. Congress passed a resolution clearing his record, acknowledging that he was not responsible for the ship's sinking. President Clinton signed it into law, finally, if belatedly, correcting a historical injustice. This exoneration brought a degree of peace to many survivors and to McVeigh's family, but it also served as a stark reminder of the lasting legacy of injustice that had shadowed the Indianapolis disaster for so long. The scars remained, both on the survivors and on the Navy's reputation. The shared trauma forged an unbreakable bond among the Indianapolis survivors. This unique brotherhood manifested in annual reunions, gatherings where men who had faced unimaginable horrors together could find solace and understanding in each other's presence. These events weren't just social occasions. They were vital acts of remembrance, a way to honor the fallen and to keep their collective story alive. They understood each other in a way no one else could, their shared experience a silent language that transcended words. Edgar Harrell dedicated a significant portion of his later life to advocacy and testimony. He felt a deep responsibility to share his story, not for personal gain, but to educate others about the sacrifices made and the profound lessons learned. His powerful testimonies, delivered with a quiet strength, spoke of faith that sustained him in the darkest hours, the sheer will to survive against impossible odds, and the resilient nature of the human spirit. He traveled extensively, speaking to groups of all ages, always emphasizing the importance of remembrance and honoring those who perished. His voice became a beacon, ensuring that the names and stories of his shipmates would not be forgotten. The Indianapolis disaster left an indelible mark, not just on its survivors, but on naval history. Militarily, crucial lessons were learned regarding communication protocols, the absolute necessity of escorts in combat zones, and the critical importance of robust search and rescue operations. The failures that led to the delayed discovery of the survivors spurred significant changes in naval procedures. On a human level, the story became a stark reminder of resilience in the face of despair, the raw power of the will to live, and the enduring capacity for hope, even when all seems lost. It underscored the importance of remembering historical tragedies, not just as dates and statistics, but as human stories of immense suffering and extraordinary courage. Memorials to the USS Indianapolis and its crew stand as solemn testaments to this sacrifice. From plaques in naval museums to the USS Indianapolis Memorial in the city itself, these sites ensure that the ship's story continues to resonate. The ongoing efforts of historians, survivors, and their families keep the memory vibrant, preventing it from fading into the annals of forgotten history. A significant moment of remembrance came in 2017 with the discovery of the wreck of the USS Indianapolis, resting nearly 4 miles beneath the Pacific Ocean. This discovery brought a sense of closure to many, finally locating the last resting place of so many brave men. It was a tangible link to a past that had long been shrouded in mystery, allowing for a new wave of recognition and respect. Edgar Harrell's final message was always one of hope, faith, and ultimately forgiveness. He spoke about finding strength in his belief, even when confronted with unspeakable horrors. He taught that even after experiencing the worst of humanity and nature, one could still find a path to healing and peace. His legacy is that of a survivor who transformed his unimaginable suffering into a powerful, enduring testimony. He proved that the human spirit, though tested by the most extreme adversity, possesses an incredible capacity to overcome, to endure, and to inspire. His life stands as a testament to the fact that even from the depths of despair, hope can emerge, and the lessons learned can continue to guide and uplift future generations.